President Donald Trump has been indicted for a fourth time, this time over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election in the state of Georgia. So the sweeping indictment came down late last night and charges Trump along with 18 other allies and advisors. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jack Saprosco, of course, has been following this and will be following this very closely. He joins us now from U.S. Capitol with more. Hello, Jackson. So a lot to break down, of course, because he's not the only one. What more do we know about the charges?
Well, good morning to you, Anthony. The central allegation here is that Trump and those 18 co-conspirators refused to accept the outcome of the 2020 election, that they refused to accept that Trump had lost, especially in the state of Georgia, and that they together joined a conspiracy to unlawfully try and change the outcome of the vote. And really what the indictment does is dial in on all those various efforts that we saw unfold in the state of Georgia, from the famous phone call in which Trump phoned Georgia's Secretary of State and asked him to find the specific number of votes that would be needed to flip the state in his favor long after the recounts and audits and election had been certified.
What's happening? Guys, welcome back to Jack Mockler. The Georgia RICO case against Trump and 18 others, built on allegations of a criminal enterprise to overturn the 2020 election, is on the verge of collapse, not because of Trump's legal maneuvering, but due to a scandal involving prosecutor Fani Willis's personal relationship with her lead investigator. The case that could have reshaped American politics now hangs by the thinnest of threads. The moment Trump was booked at the Fulton County Jail, with his mugshot splashed across every news outlet in the world, it felt like history was being made. Here was a former president, and now current president again, facing criminal charges that could have ended his political career.
To the allegations that Trump-friendly campaign workers illegally accessed voting machines, and that's something that an independent journalist actually walked in on at one point. And so what was done here is that the Attorney General in Georgia, the District Attorney in Georgia has woven all of these together into a RICO case, which is an organized crime statute typically used to prosecute members of the mob. And instead, she's saying, look, racketeering charges are warranted here because of the level of coordination. And Anthony, in the indictment that dropped yesterday, she outlines 8 ways that the group tried to obstruct the election, and then 161 separate actions that were taken over the course of that obstruction.
Now, you mentioned the group. He is not the only one. Who else can we include in this?
I think this is what's so remarkable here. You've got Mark Meadows, who was the former White House chief of staff, now the highest-ranking White House official to be named in any of the legal problems facing Donald Trump. You've got Rudy Giuliani, of course, Trump's lawyer, a pioneer of using RICO charges, now facing them himself. You've got Sidney Powell, the Trump attorney who was out there leveling all sorts of theories about how the election had been stolen. And in fact, some people on Trump's own inner circle called her a crackpot.
Legal analysts were on television every night, breaking down the intricacies of Georgia's RICO statute and explaining how Willis had built what appeared to be an airtight case. They talked about the extensive investigation, the grand jury proceedings, the mountain of evidence that had been gathered. It all seemed so solid, so carefully constructed, so destined to result in accountability for actions that many Americans believed threatened the very foundations of democratic governance. But beneath the surface of this seemingly unstoppable prosecution, problems were brewing that would eventually bring the entire enterprise to its knees. Here's where the story takes its most dramatic and unexpected turn. It emerged in early 2024.
She's now charged, and you've even got a top former DOJ official charged, as well as other Trump supporters and sympathizers. So really speaks to a broad case here. Anthony, we should also point out that there are 30 unindicted co-conspirators here mentioned as well, and you have to think that prosecutors are going to try and put pressure on those 30 individuals to flip on the main 19 people, including Donald Trump in this case.
Yeah, that kind of leads to the point whether this changes the calculus over the ultimate trial. When it comes to this, because people are just trying to wrap their head around, because as you mentioned, the fourth indictment, this follows the federal charges earlier. So these are state level charges. How does that change everything?
Yeah, first of all, Donald Trump is going to try and get this moved to federal court. He tried that in New York as well with the Stormy Daniels case. He's not likely to succeed there. State-level charges are a completely different issue for the former president here. First and foremost, if he is convicted, he cannot receive a presidential pardon. That means if he's reelected, he can't pardon himself. No future president can pardon him of state-level charges. A governor in Georgia does not even have pardon power. So a Republican governor in the state in the future.
That Fani Willis had been engaged in a romantic relationship with Nathan Wade, the special prosecutor she had personally hired to lead the Trump case. Now, let me pause here and make sure you understand why this is such a massive problem. Wade was being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money to work on this prosecution. That's public money, money that belongs to the citizens of Georgia. And according to court filings and testimony, some of that money was allegedly used to fund trips and vacations that Willis participated in. We're not talking about a casual coffee date or a dinner out. We're talking about travel expenses, hotel stays, and other costs that raised serious questions about whether Wade was using his position and his compensation to benefit his romantic partner.
Could not pardon him. Pardons are decided by a state-level panel. That's the biggest thing to keep in mind here. The other thing to remember is that unlike federal courts where there are no cameras allowed, in Georgia's courts, everything is televised, which means this trial will be televised. It's quite likely that Trump's initial appearance will even be televised. We should also point out that it's quite likely we'll see a mugshot out of this case, which is not something we've seen in the federal courts. So lots to watch there. As for how this unfolds, Trump and his co-defendants have until next Friday, that's August 25th, to turn themselves in. We don't know exactly when Trump will make his initial appearance yet. That's still being sorted out. And we should also point out for the record that when you add in Georgia now, the former president is facing 91 separate charges against set out across 4 different cases. That is remarkable. That is completely historic.
So you make a very profound point, and you mentioned if he is reelected, he cannot receive a pardon if he is convicted. But in terms of the overall fundraising and reelection chances, what does it mean, because of the state, what does it mean for his chances overall? Can he continue if he is convicted?
The appearance of impropriety was so glaring that it was impossible to ignore. Trump's defense team, always quick to seize on any weakness in the prosecution's case, pounced on this revelation with the ferocity of a predator that had just spotted an opening. They filed motions to have Willis disqualified from the case, arguing that her relationship with Wade created an insurmountable conflict of interest. They argued that the entire prosecution had been tainted from the very beginning, that Willis had compromised the integrity of the case by hiring someone she was romantically involved with and then benefiting from the financial arrangement that resulted. The defense team's argument was simple but devastating.
You know, each one of these indictments has actually helped Donald Trump, at least internally with Republicans, and that's who he's got to win over right now, right? He's got to win the party's nomination. Each indictment results in him raising millions of dollars, especially from small-time individual donors who feel compelled to give him their money. They buy his argument, his defense, that this is a politically motivated witch hunt. They are all in on Donald Trump. It's hurting his fellow Republican contenders big time. They are sinking further and further back in the pack. The question, of course, is what does it mean in the general election if he's successful in winning the nominations? Do Americans as a whole have an appetite for electing an indicted, potentially convicted president? That we don't know. What we do know is that the 2024 campaign schedule is going to run up against a packed court calendar for the former president. Fani Willis, the district attorney in Georgia, has said she wants to prosecute this case within the next 6 months. We know that Jack Smith, the federal special counsel going after Trump on similar election interference charges, is looking at starting his trial as early as January 2nd.
Even if every allegation against Trump was true, even if the evidence was overwhelming, the prosecution was so ethically compromised that it could not be allowed to proceed. The appearance of impropriety alone, they argued, was enough to disqualify Willis and potentially derail the entire case. And you know what? The courts agreed. The Georgia Court of Appeals ruled that Willis's relationship with Wade created an appearance of impropriety that undermined the integrity of the prosecution. They disqualified her from the case, effectively removing the person who had built the entire prosecution from the ground up. Wade had already resigned, leaving the case without any prosecutor at all. And just like that, one of the most significant criminal cases in modern American history was thrown into complete chaos. The prosecution that had seemed so unstoppable was now paralyzed, unable to move forward, unable to do anything except wait and hope that someone would step up to take over. Now we find ourselves in a race against time. Judge Scott McAfee has set a deadline of November 14th for Georgia to find a new prosecutor willing to take on this case. If no one steps forward by that date, the charges will be dismissed. Not because Trump proved his innocence, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because the prosecution was so ethically compromised that there was no way to continue. Think about the gravity of that for a moment. Years of investigation, millions of dollars in taxpayer money, 19 defendants, RICO charges that could have carried decades in prison, all potentially gone because the district attorney couldn't keep her personal life separate from her professional responsibilities. The irony is almost too much to process. The people who were supposed to be upholding the law, who were supposed to be the adults in the room ensuring accountability, are the ones who have created this disastrous situation. Trump's team is understandably thrilled with how this has played out. They're calling it vindication. They're saying it proves everything they've been arguing since day one, that this was never about justice. It was always about politics. It was about weaponizing the legal system to damage Trump and prevent him from returning to political power. And honestly, when you look at how this entire saga has unfolded, it's becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss that narrative. Because here's the uncomfortable question that everyone needs to ask. If this case was really about protecting democracy, if it was really about holding powerful people accountable for trying to overturn an election, then why did it hinge so completely on one prosecutor? Why was there no backup plan? Why were ethical standards so lax that a relationship scandal could bring the entire prosecution to its knees? The fact that all of this was allowed to happen, the fact that there was apparently no oversight, no safeguards, no institutional checks to prevent this kind of disaster, raises serious questions about whether the prosecution was ever as solid as its supporters claimed. The public perception of this case has shifted dramatically. People who were once confident that Trump would face justice are now watching in disbelief as the prosecution implodes. Trump supporters, on the other hand, are seeing this as confirmation of everything they've believed all along. They see a system that is corrupt and politicized, a system that tried to take down their leader and failed spectacularly because of its own incompetence and ethical failures. This is the kind of story that reinforces existing beliefs on both sides of the political divide. It doesn't change anyone's mind. It just makes people more entrenched in their positions. But beyond the partisan reactions, there's a deeper concern here about the health of our institutions. When a case this important falls apart because of prosecutorial misconduct, it damages public trust in the entire justice system. It makes people wonder if anyone can be trusted to enforce the law fairly and consistently. Let me dive deeper into what the RICO charges actually meant, because understanding the legal framework helps explain why this case was such a big deal in the first place. RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a federal law that was passed back in the 1970s specifically to combat organized crime. The genius of RICO is that it allows prosecutors to go after entire criminal enterprises, not just individual criminals. Instead of prosecuting each crime separately, prosecutors can connect everything together into one overarching conspiracy. They can show that multiple people were working together as part of a coordinated criminal organization, and they can charge everyone involved as part of that enterprise. It's the legal tool that was used to dismantle the mafia, to break up drug cartels, and to bring down sophisticated criminal networks that operated across state lines. In Georgia, they have their own version of RICO that works in much the same way. When Willis brought these RICO charges against Trump and his co-defendants, she was essentially saying that they had operated as a criminal organization. She was arguing that the attempts to overturn the Georgia election results weren't just a series of isolated incidents. They were part of a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple people working together toward a common goal. The indictment detailed numerous acts that were supposedly part of this conspiracy, including making false statements to state legislators, submitting fake slates of electors, pressuring election officials to change vote counts, and participating in efforts to disrupt the certification of the election results. The RICO framework allowed Willis to present all of this as one massive case, making it easier to show the full scope of the alleged criminal activity. But here's the thing about RICO cases. They're incredibly complex and resource-intensive. They require years of investigation, extensive evidence gathering, and careful coordination among multiple prosecutors and investigators. You can't just throw a RICO case together overnight. It takes time, money, and institutional commitment to build a successful RICO prosecution. And that's what made the Georgia case so significant. It represented a massive investment of prosecutorial resources, all aimed at holding a former president accountable for actions that many Americans believed threatened the very foundations of democratic governance. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and that's what makes the current situation so devastating. All of that time, all of that money, all of that effort, potentially wasted because of ethical failures by the people who were supposed to be leading the prosecution. The timeline of how we got here is important to understand. The investigation into Trump's efforts to overturn the Georgia election results began shortly after the 2020 election. A special grand jury was convened to hear evidence and make recommendations. Willis spent months building the case, carefully documenting the alleged criminal conduct, gathering witness testimony, and assembling the evidence that would eventually form the basis of the indictment. In August 2023, the grand jury returned the indictment, charging Trump and 18 others with violating Georgia's RICO statute. The indictment was detailed and comprehensive, laying out dozens of specific acts that were allegedly part of the criminal conspiracy. It was a legal document that seemed to leave no stone unturned, no piece of evidence unexamined, no potential witness untested. But even as the case was moving forward, there were warning signs that something was wrong. Questions about Willis's relationship with Wade had been circulating for months before they became public. There were rumors, whispers in legal circles, concerns that the prosecution might be compromised. But it wasn't until early 2024 that these concerns became impossible to ignore. Court filings revealed the extent of the relationship and the financial arrangements that had been made. Testimony was taken, evidence was presented, and the full scope of the ethical violations became clear. The defense team argued that the relationship created an appearance of impropriety that tainted the entire prosecution. And eventually, the courts agreed. The disqualification of Willis was a seismic event in the case. She had been the driving force behind the prosecution from the very beginning. She had made the decision to charge Trump and his co-defendants. She had overseen the investigation, managed the grand jury proceedings, and guided the case through its early stages. Removing her from the case was like removing the engine from a car. The prosecution was still there, but it had no power to move forward. Wade's resignation made the situation even worse, leaving the case without any prosecutor at all. And that brings us to where we are now, with a case that has no one to prosecute it and a deadline that's rapidly approaching. The search for a replacement prosecutor is proving to be extraordinarily difficult. And frankly, it's not hard to understand why. Whoever takes this job is stepping into a nightmare. They're inheriting a case that has already been tainted by scandal, a case where the previous prosecutor was disqualified for ethical violations, a case that has become a political lightning rod. They're going to face intense scrutiny from both sides. Trump's defense team will attack their credibility at every opportunity, pointing to the Willis scandal and arguing that the entire prosecution is compromised. Supporters of the case will demand that they pursue the charges aggressively, while critics will accuse them of continuing a politically motivated witch hunt. It's a no-win situation. There's no way to take this job without making powerful enemies on both sides. And then there's the practical challenge. Whoever takes over will have to get up to speed on a case that has been developing for years. They'll have to review thousands of pages of evidence, understand the complex RICO framework, and develop a strategy for moving forward. All of this needs to happen while dealing with the intense media scrutiny and political pressure that comes with any case involving Donald Trump. It's a massive undertaking that would be challenging under the best of circumstances. Under these circumstances, it's nearly impossible. That's why Judge McAfee gave the extension. He recognized that finding a replacement prosecutor isn't like hiring someone for a regular job. It's a complex, difficult process that takes time. But even with the extension, time is running out. If November 14th arrives and Georgia hasn't found a replacement prosecutor, the case will be dismissed. This isn't speculation. This is the legal reality. You can't have criminal charges sitting indefinitely with no one to prosecute them. The court has made it clear that there's a limit to how long they'll wait. And if that deadline passes, Trump walks away from the Georgia case completely. There's no refiling later. Double jeopardy rules mean that once the charges are dismissed, they're gone for good. This is the end of the line. If Georgia can't find someone to take over by November 14th, one of the biggest legal threats Trump was facing will simply vanish. The implications of this case potentially falling apart are staggering, and they extend far beyond the fate of Donald Trump. We're talking about public trust in the justice system, the credibility of legal institutions, and the ability of prosecutors to hold powerful people accountable. When a case this important implodes because of ethical failures by the prosecution, it sends a message that the system is broken. It tells people that the law doesn't matter, that politics is more important than justice, that even the most serious allegations can be derailed by personal drama and incompetence. That's not a message anyone should be comfortable with, regardless of their political views. Think about what it means for the people who believed that this case would deliver accountability. They watched as the prosecution was built, as the evidence was gathered, as the charges were filed. They had hope that the legal system would work, that even a former president could be held responsible for his actions. And now they're watching that hope evaporate because of a scandal that had nothing to do with the actual allegations. It's not that Trump proved his innocence. It's not that the evidence was insufficient. It's that the prosecution was so ethically compromised that it couldn't continue. That's not justice. That's just failure. And think about what it means for the people who believed all along that Trump was being persecuted. They see this as vindication, as proof that the system was out to get him and that it failed. They see a prosecution that was built on shaky ethical ground, a prosecutor who was more interested in personal relationships than in justice, and a case that couldn't withstand basic scrutiny. Whether or not they're right about the underlying allegations, the way this case has unfolded has reinforced their belief that the legal system is corrupt and politicized. That's a dangerous belief to have about a system that depends on public trust to function. The broader political implications are equally significant. We're heading into the 2026 midterm elections, and this case was supposed to be a major issue. Democrats were hoping to use it to demonstrate that Trump was a criminal who should not be allowed to hold office. Republicans were hoping to use it to demonstrate that the system was weaponized against Trump. Now, neither side is getting what they wanted. The case is imploding in a way that leaves everyone unsatisfied. It's the kind of outcome that reinforces cynicism and disillusionment, that makes people feel like the system is rigged no matter who wins. The public opinion dynamics here are fascinating. Polls have shown that Trump's legal battles haven't hurt him with his base. If anything, they've energized them. They see these prosecutions as evidence that the establishment is trying to stop him, and that just makes them more determined to support him. Independent voters, on the other hand, are more conflicted. They might be uncomfortable with Trump's conduct, but they're also uncomfortable with what they see as the weaponization of the legal system. When a case falls apart like this, it confirms their worst fears. It makes them think that everyone is playing politics, that no one is really interested in justice, and that the whole system is broken. What happens next is uncertain, but we can think through the likely scenarios. Option 1 is that Georgia finds a replacement prosecutor. This would allow the case to continue, at least in some form. But even if a new prosecutor steps forward, the challenges they face would be immense. They'd have to rebuild credibility, convince a jury that the case is legitimate despite everything that's happened, and overcome the Trump defense team's relentless attacks on the prosecution's integrity. It's a tall order. Option 2 is that no one steps forward and the case is dismissed. This is probably the most likely outcome, given the difficulty of the situation. The path of least resistance is to just let it go, to admit that the case was bungled and move on. Option 3 is that the deadline is extended again, but that's unlikely. At some point, the court has to say enough is enough. Either prosecute the case or drop it. You can't keep the charges pending indefinitely. The precedent being set here is troubling. It suggests that even major criminal prosecutions can be derailed by ethical failures by the prosecution. It suggests that powerful defendants can escape accountability not by proving their innocence, but by waiting for the prosecution to implode. That's not a precedent anyone should be comfortable with. The justice system depends on the idea that the people enforcing the law are held to the highest ethical standards. When they're not, when they're allowed to get away with ethical violations that compromise their cases, the entire system is undermined. And yet, there's a certain justice in what's happening. The idea that prosecutors should be held to a higher standard is a fundamental principle of our legal system. If you're going to prosecute someone for serious crimes, you have to do it cleanly. You have to follow the rules. You have to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The Willis situation was a clear violation of that principle. She didn't just make a minor ethical error. She created a situation that raised serious questions about the integrity of the entire prosecution. The courts recognized that and acted accordingly. In that sense, the system worked. It identified a problem and took steps to address it. The fact that those steps might result in the case being dismissed is unfortunate, but it's also a testament to the importance of ethical standards in the justice system. The real question now is whether the damage to public trust can be repaired. There are people on both sides of this issue who have lost faith in the justice system. Trump supporters see this as proof of a political witch hunt that collapsed under its own weight. Trump critics see this as proof that the system protects powerful people who can afford to wait out their legal problems. Neither perspective is entirely wrong. The case was compromised by ethical failures, but it was also a serious attempt to hold a powerful person accountable. The truth is somewhere in the middle, but the middle is where nuance and complexity live, and nuance and complexity don't make for compelling headlines. As we approach the November 14th deadline, all eyes will be on Georgia. Will they find someone to take on this case, or will one of the biggest prosecutions in American history simply disappear? The answer to that question will tell us something important about where we are as a country right now. It will tell us whether we can still handle big, important cases without turning them into complete circuses. It will tell us whether our institutions are strong enough to survive the political pressures that come with cases like this. And it will tell us whether the justice system can still deliver accountability, or whether it has become just another tool for political warfare. One thing is certain: this story isn't over. Even if the case is dismissed, the broader questions it raises about justice, politics, and public trust will continue to be debated. The implications of this case will be felt for years, regardless of what happens on November 14th. We're watching a moment in American history that will shape how people think about the justice system for a generation. And that's why it's so important to pay attention, to understand what's happening, and to think critically about what it all means.